Got to start by fixing the hair. Probably should have done it before I sat down to record, but that's okay. Hello, everybody. If you are new here, welcome. And if you are not, welcome back. This episode, wait, why did I just say episode? Okay, I guess I'm kind of recording a podcast at the same time, but this video today is really for those of you out there who are managers or those of you who are being managed by someone. Today, we're going to be talking about 7 lessons I learned as a manager. For those of you that don't know, I stepped down from being a manager back in late June, mostly because being a manager just became unsustainable with my business. And this post, this video, the blog that goes along with it is 6 months in the making, because I've spent the last 6 months really trying to get a handle on and wrap my brain around what are the things that I learned while I was a manager. What are the things that I learned about being a manager, and the necessities and the requirements and skills that you need to have if you're going into management. So I kind of think of today as, for those of you who are considering being a manager, these are some of the things that you need to know. And for those of you that are being managed, these are some good insights to have, because I think sometimes, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I started managing, sometimes we think that our managers, because they're higher up in our organizations or company, we think that they have so much more power and so much more say than they actually do. And I really hope that's going to come across today. And it's just going to come across how much is really on their plate and how difficult it can sometimes be to be a manager. So these are 7 lessons I learned as a manager. So lesson number 1 is that being a manager is 1,000% about relationships. Now, this shouldn't come as a shock to anyone, but management is about relationships first and foremost. It's about the relationships you have in your team, the trust that you have in them, but probably most importantly, the trust that they have in you. But when I say it's about relationships, let me break it down a little bit more. I say it's about relationships because I would say it's about emotion management more so than people management. This was a lesson that I learned really, really quickly as a manager, that my job was a lot less about keeping track of and helping my team members stay on top of their tasks and their responsibilities and their to-dos in their work, but it was really a lot about emotion management when it came to them being disappointed by a bonus, or them being disappointed by a lack of promotion, or really frustrations around changes that are happening in the organization. If you work for an organization that isn't great at change management, then that burden of dealing with some of the insecurities, the questions, all that can come with change, that falls on the manager. And sometimes they aren't necessarily given all of the information they need to fully answer the questions and handle the insecurities that are going to come with that change. So a lot about what managers are doing is they are not only trying to manage their emotions through change and their emotions through disappointment, but they're really, really trying to manage the emotions of their team. So if you're not somebody who's comfortable with emotions, management might not be the best place for you. Similarly, though, it's not just about your team's emotions, it's also about you managing your own emotions, or more so taking your own emotions out of the equation. I very quickly came to realize that it wasn't about my personal feelings towards someone on my team. It was about the job that they were doing and if they were doing it well. They may do things different than I did, but frankly, in a lot of situations in my organization, and this might be the same for yours as well, the way in which they did things didn't matter. It was the results that they got. And if I couldn't argue with the results, I really couldn't argue with how they were going about doing it. So I had to take my own emotions and opinions and perspectives out of the equation sometimes when it came to judging my team members and how they were doing. It's also hugely not about jumping to conclusions. And I think sometimes in our relationships, we might allow ourselves to do that, or we might think that that's okay. But when it comes to management, this is particularly important that you're not jumping to conclusions. Even if a situation with the team member seems sketchy AF and it is outwardly grounds for termination, there might be something going on in the background. I had a situation where a team member of mine seemed borderline intoxicated, or at least on something, during a meeting with a client. And naturally, the client was not very happy about that. It was uncomfortable for me to watch back the meeting that we had because of kind of how this person looked. And I could have gone into that meeting just basically saying, this isn't okay, I don't care what the hell happened, but it's not okay and you need to fix it, and this is potentially grounds for termination. I could have gone into the meeting like that, but instead I went into the meeting just kind of being like, all right, I want to hear their side. And it turned out they were having a reaction to a medication, and that is why they appeared the way they were. And so, yeah, we had action steps. Yeah, we had to make a game plan for how do we deal with that to make sure it doesn't happen again. But if I jumped to conclusions from the get-go instead of trusting that my team member was doing everything they could to show up at their best, that could have been a very different situation. So thing number one is that management is about relationships. It's about emotions. It's about managing the emotions of your team and yourself. And it's making sure that you are respecting people, trusting people, and not jumping to conclusions. Lesson number two is that management requires organization. Holy crap, will your email volume drastically increase as a manager? And I was not prepared for that. Your number of meetings will likely also dramatically increase, which I was more prepared for that, but I wasn't as prepared as I should have been. And I learned eventually, and I frankly wish I'd learned this sooner, that the little rituals and the little routines that you have in your day for catching little tasks, for organizing to-dos, for taking notes, they matter a lot when it comes to being a manager. Until I learned that, there were little things that were falling through the cracks as a manager. I had to really lock in a task and notes management system that worked, and I frankly wish I had done that sooner. That actually, I think, should be the very, very first tip. Like if we're speaking tangibly, a first thing you should do as a manager is experiment with and find a good task and note management system. Obviously, Notion is my system of choice, and in my anti-burnout digital planner, I have some systems that I use for keeping track of my team members, for keeping track of notes. That's all built into my anti-burnout Notion digital planner. So if you are somebody in corporate who has a lot of notes to manage, who has a team to manage, and you're feeling like your systems aren't great, check out that. I've got it linked in the description below so that you can start to kind of play around and improve your systems for organizing. I also really never fell into a rhythm with my team meetings. I think one of the big things that I ran into is if a good discussion was happening, I didn't want to interrupt it, and I just generally didn't want to interrupt people. But as a result of that, the ends of my team meetings were always rushed. Sometimes I went overtime. Sometimes I was frantically wrapping up at the end of team meetings. I wish I would learn earlier that people appreciate punctuality, and if you go over time on your meetings, it's your fault, and it's not the fault of the person who talked too much. So organization, whether it's the systems you're using to wrangle information or your organization in meetings, is super, super important. And it took me way too long as a manager to figure out that I needed to improve my systems there. Lesson number 3 is being a manager requires boundaries. I know so many managers struggle with this. And when I'm doing corporate speaking engagements, this is usually one of the biggest questions that I get asked. We struggle to turn off at the end of the day because we feel like our team members need us. But here's what I came to realize. If I didn't take the space from my day job and respect my own boundaries, not only would my team never respect my boundaries, but I actually found that I grew to resent them. In situations where I wasn't abiding the boundaries that I had set for myself, I grew to resent my team, and that is not what I want. Some of the biggest and most game-changing things I did were, first and foremost, I wrote a team standards document. This is actually something we dive into in my Anti-Burnout Collective memberships. I've got a section called Corporate Burnout Buster, and in it, for those of you who are managers, I walk you through and I give you a template for how to create your own team standards document. Basically, what this is it is a document that details what they can expect from me in terms of my boundaries, in terms of my organization and commitment to them, in terms of my goals for them, but also my expectations for them and my boundaries along when I'm going to be available. So if that's something you need support with, head to the link below in the description and check out my Anti-Burnout Collective Inner Circle memberships so that you can learn a little bit more about that. This is also something that my company instigated, which I'm really, really grateful for, and I enjoyed it so much that I brought it into my Inner Circle. I also diligently set out of office reminders for when I was out of office, and I did not respond to requests, texts, emails, etc. that came through when I was out of office. This is something that I am a massive stickler about because I do still have a day job, and even though I'm not managing anymore, I still do this in my day job, that when I am out of office, I am out of office. I am not available to clients, and back when I was a manager, I wasn't available to my team either. This might seem a little aggressive and a little harsh, but frankly, my company had emergency protocols in place if somebody who was working on the weekend needed support so that their manager did not have to be on call to them. Because I work in a company where we have people working essentially 24/7. And no matter who the manager is, we just can't physically be available for that. So we have emergency protocols in place. So when I'm disconnected, I'm disconnected. I also communicated my hours proactively as well. When I got a new client that came in, I would say, hey, I work this day to this day from approximately this time to this time. And I did the exact same thing with my team members. So not only did I communicate it outright, but it was also in my email signature. Below all the professional stuff, I would have below my email signature that I work from this day to this day, from this time to this time, approximately. So then when I got emails from clients or team members outside of those hours, I didn't feel as bad about not responding because they had that communicated to them up front anytime they emailed me. Now, with all of this communicating of my boundaries, this actually brings me to lesson number 4, that being a manager requires extensive communication, often over communication. In the last section, we talked about some of the ways in which I communicated my boundaries. You notice that when it came to my hours, I had that in my team standards, I had that in my out-of-office responders, and I had that in my email signature. But the other things I found that it was super, super important to communicate and over-communicate were things like deadlines. Whenever we had a deadline coming up on my team, especially if it was something that could potentially impact a team member's bonus or their review or anything like that, I realized very, very quickly that if I didn't proactively communicate that deadline was coming up, I would get all of these last minute emails from team members with questions about how to fill out forms and da-da-da-da. And I was often, and if they didn't hear from me via email, then they would start blowing up my phone and starting texting me. And when people are blowing up your phone, it's pretty hard to say, well, I'm not going to respond. So it made me very frustrated. So what I did the next time that deadline came around, I sent a 10-day reminder. I sent a 1-week reminder. I sent a 5-day, a 3-day, and a day of reminder email. And my thought was, if you wait until the day it's due, which is a day that I'm not working, I am not available to answer your question. From my perspective, you are an adult and you should plan ahead and not procrastinate. And if you do procrastinate, that's not my fault. That's not my responsibility. It is not on me. So if there are deadlines coming up, I schedule out emails to over communicate, hey, this deadline is approaching. But beyond that, you got to let adults be adults. I also over communicated my expectations. This was especially important if there was some sort of company-wide policy change, some fundamental aspect of a job was changing. And in the work we do, basically everybody I manage has the exact same job requirements and job expectations. But if something like that was changing, not only did they hear it straight from me, but they heard it straight from me 4 or more times. Last but not least, consequences. I communicated and over communicated consequences. So if someone on my team was struggling and they needed to improve in some way, or it could be potentially grounds for termination, then I needed to not only state the consequences in our one-on-one meeting, but I also stated the consequence in a follow-up email and in a reminder email as well. And when I did that, I would put something in the email along the lines of, I know we already talked about this, but I just want to be clear to make sure that there's no confusion. Here are the expectations moving forward of how you're going to rectify this. Along those same lines, I found it very, very important to communicate in multiple different mediums. I find everybody has their own communication preferences. Somebody might like, text. Somebody might like email. Somebody might like Slack. Email and Slack were the two main things. And frankly, if somebody wanted to text every single time something happened, I would have told them that they need to check their email and check Slack, because I'm not going to send personal text messages. But I did communicate things by multiple different emails or mediums. If there was a big announcement happening in the company, not only did I say it out loud in team meetings, but I would send an email and I would send a Slack. Sometimes this meant people were getting the same information multiple times, but my perspective, I'm covering all of my bases. For the people who aren't great at checking email, I'm hitting them via Slack. And for the people who aren't checking Slack very often, I am hitting them up via email. So everybody really has no excuse for not seeing the information. So to recap, we have done 4 lessons so far. Number 1 is that management is 1,000% about relationships and so much more about emotion management than people management. Lesson number 2 Lesson number 2 was that management requires organization. Tangible tip, if you are starting as a manager, one of the first things you should do is experiment with and find a good task and note management system for you. If you need help, if you want some templates to get you started, head to the link below. Check out my Notion digital planner in the description because I have some corporate templates in there for meetings, note-taking, and for team management that worked amazingly for me when I was a manager. Lesson number 3 was it requires boundaries, and some of the places I communicated those boundaries were in my team standards document, in my out-of-office responders, and in my email signature. And then the 4th lesson we talked about was that it requires communication, sometimes over-communication, and communication via different mediums. Lesson number 5 is it requires training. I think we do ourselves a disservice at too many companies where we look at somebody and say, oh, hey, you're doing your job well. You should be able to manage other people who are also doing that job. That is often not the case. Just because someone was good at the work that they were doing in their job before doesn't mean they're going to be good at the management aspects. Like we talked about, it's much more about relationships than it is about tasks. So it's going to require training in having difficult conversations, being able to deal with potential issues of termination, knowing when somebody needs to be, or somebody or something needs to be escalated to a supervisor or turned over to HR, organizational skills, leadership skills, the ability to put things in multiple different contexts, and probably most importantly, being able to explain the why behind a change, even if it wasn't explained to you well. Because I can tell you right now, there were changes that happened in my company and my organization that were still being fully fleshed out and that I didn't really fully have time to buy into before the change was implemented. And you have to lead. You have to lead by example, even if you're still figuring things out. And that was a tough lesson for me to learn. Lesson number 6 is it is a thankless job. This might be a little bit of a controversial opinion, but I stand by it. I actually wrote an article back when I was exploring science communication and science writing as a career about how public health is like defense, a thankless job. And I honestly feel the same way about management. As a manager, I got comments saying that I communicated too much or I communicated too little. I was told I needed to manage my time better in team meetings, but I was also told that people really appreciated that I gave them the floor. Some people liked my personality. Some people didn't like my personality. They thought I was unprofessional. Like, as I sit here in a massively baggy, bright green sweatshirt, I don't necessarily think I'm the most professional person in the world, but whatever. Some team members thought that I managed the change in our bonus structure really, really well, and some people were a little frustrated that I didn't have more answers. Basically, you're not going to make everyone happy. The thing that everyone who isn't a manager needs to know is managers don't have all the information, and even if they do, they have often little power to address concerns and make changes. I remember changes that were happening where they quote unquote came to us for feedback, and yet when we gave that feedback, it kind of felt like it fell on deaf ears because they'd already decided they were going to make the change. That is, in a nutshell, what it is like and what it feels like to be a manager. You know, I had people on my team that I felt like deserved bonuses or promotions, and they weren't given one for arbitrary reasons. And in situations like that, my hands are tied. You know, I had people who should have been more successful in the company who were getting overlooked, and my hands were tied. That is being a manager in a nutshell. Your manager might be the biggest advocate for you in the world and have zero power to be able to change anything that you might want them to. That is something I wish more employees knew about their manager, is that they really don't have as much control as you think they do. I was often asked to manage through changes that I wasn't sold on yet and I still had questions about, but sometimes organizations push changes ahead even if they haven't worked out all of the kinks and all of the details. Managers just have to roll with the punches and deal with the frustration that might come with their ability to not, or their inability to not fully answer questions. And it's really, really hard, especially because people who usually go into management, especially who choose to go into management, they're usually doing it because they care. And sometimes, this is a little known fact, sometimes your manager has literally taken a pay cut to be a manager, knowing that they wanted to help people so badly that they felt like it was worth it. I'm not saying don't expect them to improve or change, but what I am saying is take it easy on them. being a manager is often a powerless position. You take the brunt of the heat for things that happen and have little control to do anything about situations. And it really, really sucks. Lesson number 7, and when I originally started gathering lessons, this was actually the first one that I came up with because I believe this to my core. It requires compassion. Compassion counts being a manager almost more than anything else does, more than your ability to be organized, to manage tasks, to lead. If somebody comes to you and you aren't able to have empathy and compassion in this difficult situation they're dealing with, they're not going to come to you again. And frankly, word might spread through your team that you're not going to be receptive to those conversations. I had the pleasure of building relationships with my team and my former team members, several of whom I'm still close to and I'm still in contact with. Even though now that I've stepped down, I have been moved to a completely different team and I'm very isolated from the people that I used to work with. But I think a big reason for that is because compassion for me is front and center. And perhaps it's because I have a coaching background. Perhaps it's because I have worked with people in very emotional situations. I am very receptive to those conversations. And I had team members come to me about personal issues they were dealing with, learning differences, psychological issues, just struggles that they were experiencing in their day-to-day life that was affecting and impacting their job, that gave such important context to their work and what they were doing and why they were struggling, that I had people flat out tell me, I've never been able to confide this in a manager before. I've never been comfortable telling a manager this before. That's what happens when you lead with compassion and understanding. When you lead with empathy, is you start to build relationships with your team and a depth of understanding of your team members that frankly stands the test of time and makes you even better at your job and frankly maybe one of the best managers in your company. So those are the lessons that I learned as a manager. I'll recap them for you really quick. I'm probably going to be looking off to the side so that I remember them all. But number 1 is it's about relationships. Number 2, it's about organization. Being a manager requires organization. It's about boundaries. It's about communication, sometimes over communication. Being a manager requires training. That's number 5. Number 6 is it's a thankless job. And I think that's really important to go into it knowing. And number 7, it requires compassion. In my opinion, the best managers are the most compassionate ones. The ones that have the most empathy and the ones that are able to take perspective the easiest. So those are my 7 lessons from being a manager. And if you're a manager, I'd love to know what you think. Do you agree? Do you have some additional lessons that you feel like you've learned? Go ahead and drop them in the comment section below. If you were somebody who's not a manager and you're just being managed, I'd love to hear if this gave you some context for what your managers might be experiencing in their work that maybe you didn't know. But with that, if you enjoyed what you heard today, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the subscribe button below. And with that, I will see you all next time. Bye.